One of the questions I get asked an awful lot is how to stain a guitar similar to what you might find on a Paul Reed Smith electric guitar that has some figured maple on it. Similar to what I've already done on this finished double low golden buckeye model that I call it. Now, Paul Reed Smith did not invent this staining technique. It's actually been used in the furniture and other industries for years. But it's pretty simple to use and fairly straightforward. I want to show you how to do it on this double low cutaway that I've got here in the white. This is curly maple. I'm not going to stain the top of it. I'm just going to stain the sides, the back, and the neck. So let's hop over to the spray booth because I have to do it there because I want to show you a couple things. I want to show you how to mix the stain. We'll come back over here and then sand it back, and then I'll show you some special treatment we need to do for this neck. I'm not aiming for a really dark color on that guitar body because I want the ebony binding that I applied to contrast nicely with it. So I'm going to make it about this color, which is a straw color, but a little bit darker because I want to emphasize the curl on it. So I'm going to use two stains. I'm going to use medium brown followed by straw. Let me show you how I mix those two colors. The first color I mixed was color tone medium brown. And the way that I mixed it was I used 1/4 teaspoon, using one of these, mixed to 3 ounces of water. And I'm going to use water for the solvent on this, not alcohol. Water gives me a little bit more open time. This is about the intensity of the color. It's not real dark. It's just going to add a little bit of brown. And this is just a tip to show you this is a real easy way to judge your color. This is just copier paper, and I cut these into strips and use them as test strips all the time. The second color I mixed is color tone straw, and I use the same ratio of 1/4 teaspoon in 3 ounces of water, and that's what this color is going to look like. Again, this is not a real dark color, and I can always adjust it later on as I go through the process. So let's go into the spray booth and we'll apply this first color, which will be the medium brown, to darken up that curl. We're now in the spray booth, and I'm going to stain this body on the StewMac guitar holder. It's a very, very valuable tool to have in your finishing shop because in this case, what it allows me to do is to work on all sides and the back at the same time when I stain it. Same thing with finishing. So it's not just for finishing or spraying or anything like that. You can also use it for a technique like this. I've also got some safe release tape applied to the top. I'm not going to stain the soundboard at all, so I want to keep all the stain off of it. I'm using just a safe release tape, and I'll take this off once I start applying the final sealer coats. So let's go ahead and apply the first medium brown dark curl stain. But before we do that, I want to point out a special application or situation that you're going to have with the neck. The problem with staining a neck with a penetrating stain like color tone dye stains is that the transition part of the heel, where it goes from the barrel to the bottom of the heel, this is end grain. And as everybody knows, end grain will stain darker than the normal part of it. So you have to kind of control it or figure out a way to control the stain so that it applies evenly. You may read all sorts of methods for doing this. Things like maybe sanding that area with like 600 grit, or even applying a stain controller or something like shellac to just that area. That's really hard. This is the easiest way to do it, and one that I first discovered when I built furniture. All you do is just take some water, which is the carrier for the dye stain that we're going to use, and just wet that area. Don't wet the whole area, just wet that end grain area. Then, when you go to apply your stain, it will be even because you've wetted that area. Now, I'm not worried about getting this stain on the rosewood peghead overlay or the ebony front overlay, because those dark woods just won't go any darker with the application of this stain that I'm using here. Same thing on the end grain of the top. Just wet it with water, and then when you apply your stain, it won't go too dark. It's just as simple as that. See how nice and even the stain is. Now, what we'll do is we'll let this dry until it's dry to the touch. We'll stain the body now, and then we'll go back over to the main area, and then we'll sand this back. Then we'll apply the final stain. When I do the body, I really don't have any end grain areas that are exposed on the sides and the back, so I'm not going to use the water technique. I'm just going to go ahead and apply the medium brown stain right with a rag. Now, you don't want the rag dripping wet because you don't want to make a mess of everything. So I take the rag, soak it for a while in the stain, and then I wring it out a bit. I'm going to start up here on this side. And once again, as I mentioned, I'm really not going to worry about getting it on the ebony because it's not going to affect the color of the ebony at all. The other thing that this will do, which is nice, is it will highlight any glue spots or any areas that might be a problem when you go apply the finish later on. Again, don't get that rag dripping wet. I like using water because it has a little bit more open time and it's a little bit easier to blend if you make a mistake. Now, let me get in a little bit closer because I want to show you something. This area right here and here are spots of glue and the stain won't take there. So those will be visible when I start the sand back process, so I'll make sure that I do a little bit extra sanding there to make sure I get rid of all that glue. Now I'll do the back. Oh yeah. When you stain with a dye, it's important that you don't apply it like you're applying a wiping stain. You want to get it all on as quickly as you can and cover the entire surface. Because if you don't do that, what happens is you'll get a dark spot where you first apply the dye, and it'll be hard to blend in. Once you've got the wood evenly covered, you can then come back and even it out, just like I'm doing here. That's the first application. We'll let this dry about 30 minutes or until the wood is dry enough to sand. We'll sand it back, then we'll apply that second stain. We're back at the bench, and now what we're going to do is sand most or all of the color off that we just applied. We're going to remove it by sanding with 240 grit, or the last grit that you used in your sanding schedule. And you can do this by hand, or you can do it with a random orbit sander like what I have here. I use a pneumatic tool. You can use an electric tool just as easily. The idea here is to just remove the color from the surface of the wood, and then you're going to stain it again. The dark color that we applied first will have sunk down into the figured curl, highlighting it, making it a little bit darker. So it's really just a process of just sanding it again. You really can't make a mistake. And then, as I mentioned in the application section, if you find a glue spot, that's a good way for you to remove it. So we'll do some of this by hand. I'll do the neck probably by hand, but I'm mostly going to use a random orbit sander. I've also got what's called an interface pad mounted on my sander. And what this does is this gives me a little bit of cushion so that I don't sand too aggressively, and it also allows me to sand the contours or the waist a little bit easier. Now, I just want to make a comment. First of all, if you compare this side to this side, you'll see that this side looks like it was freshly sanded, but there's just a little bit of color left in the deep curl. On a lot of PRS guitars, he uses a very dark stain. And you can do that if you want to really darken up that curl. So instead of using the medium brown in the mixture that I showed you, maybe double it or even triple the strength of the dye so that you get that curl a lot darker, like what you would see on a PRS electric. As I just mentioned, I typically sand the neck by hand. It's just a lot easier. And what I like to use is a double-sided, or what we call a double density sanding block. You can find these at automotive supply stores. It's got one soft side and a hard side. And the soft side I use for the round portions and up around here where the transition is. For the complicated areas, up around like the transition, up to the peg head, I'll just use my fingers as a backing block. Don't forget the end grain here. Now, when I'm done with this, I like to do one thing which kind of finalizes and evens out the color. I take some maroon Scotch-Brite, this product here, and just go over the whole surface. And this just kind of evens everything out. Looking good. Now what we'll do is we'll head back over to the spray area and we'll apply that second coat of color. We're now ready to apply the second stain color. And as I said before, if this wasn't dark enough, use a darker color dye. You can always make that first color stronger if you want. Again, I don't want to darken overall color on this curly maple because I want to have some nice contrast to the ebony bindings. So let's go ahead and apply the second color, which is the straw color. The other thing I want to mention here is that as you apply the dye, the color of the dye or the color of the wood when it's wet with the dye initially will pretty much be your final color. So you can make adjustments on the fly. We'll do that if we have to. But let's just go ahead and start with the body. That's looking pretty good because I want that ebony to really contrast. But if I wanted it darker, I would just add more color to this. Let's see what the neck looks like. Now, I'm not doing that water technique on the neck or at the heel there because I was more worried about the dark color getting that transition area too dark. What this is really looking like to me is pretty much what I wanted, which is it looks pretty much like just old maple that's aged naturally, but really emphasizes that curl. Now for the sides. Oh yeah, just what I wanted. So there's your double stain PRS style technique. As I said, you can always make adjustments to this technique. If you want to make that first color a lot darker to get that curl really dark, please do so. You can use like a dark brown, like say tobacco brown, or maybe even dark walnut. And that looks really good if you use a second color like purple or blue or red or orange or something like that. Also, keep in mind that you can modify or change the second color. You can make it darker and you can just add more dye if you want to, or if you want to, just sand it again and apply a color that you like. So that's pretty much it. It's not rocket science. Happy finishing, and we'll see you next time.